12 of the 17 turbines inside the Hoover Dam are about to fail, not from a system overload, not from a cyber attack, but from thirst. The mechanism is a critical elevation marker on the wall of Lake Mead, just upstream, an invisible line drawn at 1,035 feet above sea level. This is the part of the story nobody in charge wants to talk about. As of July 2026, the largest reservoir in the United States is dropping directly toward that line, and there is nothing left to stop it. An instant 70 to 80% of Hoover Dam's power generation capacity will simply vanish. Air bubbles, forming in the low-pressure environment, will begin to act like shrapnel, tearing at the turbine blades. A phenomenon called cavitation. To prevent the literal destruction of the machinery, 12 generators will be shut down. This is not a distant forecast. It is a certainty. Tom Buschatzke, the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, confirmed it in May of this year. His words. We're going to go to 1,035. There's no question that's going to happen. To understand what is about to unfold, you have to look past the dam itself and into the numbers that govern its failure. The dam's official minimum power pool is 950 feet, but that is a statistical illusion, a number made possible only by a few newly upgraded turbines. The real crisis begins much higher, at 1,035 feet. That is the turbine cliff. Power does not gracefully decline. It falls. The Western Area Power Administration, the federal agency that delivers this hydroelectricity across the Southwest, will lose the equivalent horsepower of a nuclear reactor overnight. Lights will not simply go out. Instead, utilities will be forced onto the open market to buy replacement power, almost certainly from natural gas plants, at a premium of 17% or more. The cost of a water crisis will arrive instantly on the power bills of millions of people who have never seen the Colorado River. And this is where the story truly begins. This catastrophe is not an accident of nature. It is the direct, calculated result of a decision made by the federal government just 3 months ago. A decision to deliberately sacrifice Hoover Dam to save another. Zoom out, and the physics of the system reveal a chain reaction. Upstream of Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam lies a second titan, Lake Powell, held back by the Glen Canyon Dam. In the spring of 2026, federal hydrologists at the Bureau of Reclamation ran the numbers. Lake Powell was crashing. Forecasts showed it would drop below its own minimum power pool of 3,490 feet by August. A complete shutdown. So on April 17, 2026, the Bureau initiated an emergency action. They cut the flow of water from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. A massive reduction. They are now holding back 1.48 million acre-feet of water. That is nearly 500 billion gallons that were supposed to flow downstream, spin Hoover's turbines, and serve the cities of the lower basin. The water is being kept in Lake Powell. To prop up its water level. To save the infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. The federal government saved one dam by knowingly sentencing the other, robbing Peter to pay Paul, in a zero-sum game played with the water supply for 40 million people. This is the detail the official press releases do not explain. The record low water level at Lake Mead, forecast by the Bureau of Reclamation's own June 2026 study to hit 1,015.77 feet by next summer, is not just the product of a megadrought. It is the product of policy. A conscious choice to starve the nation's largest reservoir. The crisis has been engineered. But this choice was not made in a vacuum. It was forced by a cascade of failures stretching back over a century. A history of promises made against a river that was never big enough to keep them. Every drop of water being held back in Lake Powell is a symptom of a much deeper problem. A mathematical error carved into law. On November 24, 1922, representatives from 7 states gathered to sign the Colorado River Compact. It was a foundational document, the so-called Law of the River, designed to divide the water and develop the American West. They based their allocations on a fatal assumption. They believed the river carried, on average, 16.4 million acre-feet of water per year. They based this number on what we now know was one of the wettest periods in the last 500 years. The true number, the average flow measured between the year 2000 and 2024, is just 12.4 million acre-feet. From its very inception, the system has carried a structural deficit. The states promised away 4 million acre-feet of water per year that does not exist. For decades, that mathematical flaw was hidden, buffered by the sheer volume of water stored in Powell and Mead when they were full. Now, the buffers are gone. 25 years of relentless drought, intensified by a warming climate that pulls ever more moisture from the snow and soil, has exposed the original sin. The river has shrunk by nearly 20%. The checking account is empty. And in 2026, the bottom fell out. The year began with a flicker of hope. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the source of 90% of the river's water, looked promising through January. Then came March. A record-shattering heat wave settled over the west. Snow that should have remained frozen deep into the spring melted almost overnight. It did not run into the streams and rivers. It sublimated, turning directly from a solid into vapor, vanishing into the dry air. By April 9th, 2026, Colorado's statewide snowpack had collapsed to just 22% of its historical median, the lowest recorded level for that date in history. The spring runoff, the annual deposit that is supposed to refill the system, failed. The inflow forecast for Lake Powell in water year 2026 cratered to just 2.78 million acre-feet. 29% of average. That number is what triggered the April 17th emergency action. It is what forced the Bureau of Reclamation to cut the throat of Lake Mead. The false spring of 2026 was the final invoice for a century of magical thinking coming due. Now here is the part nobody knows how to solve. The laws written to manage this system, the 2007 interim guidelines, and the 2019 drought contingency plans, are set to expire. On December 31st, 2026, they simply cease to exist. The rulebook for how to operate the dams, how to allocate shortages, how to prevent a legal and operational collapse of water delivery will be gone. The federal government gave the 7 basin states a deadline. February 14th, 2026. Come to a consensus, they said. Present a unified plan for how to manage the river after 2026. The states failed. The deadline came and went with no agreement. The upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, refused to take mandatory cuts to bail out the lower basin. Becky Mitchell, Colorado's lead negotiator, represents their position. They believe the lower basin, particularly Arizona and California, has been overusing its share for a century and must bear the brunt of the corrections. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, argue they have senior water rights and growing cities that depend on every drop. They cannot simply turn off the taps. The gridlock was absolute. So the federal government stepped in. On February 14th, the day the deadline was missed, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum announced an unprecedented federal takeover. His statement was blunt. While the 7 basin states have not reached full consensus on an operating framework, the department cannot delay action. Meeting this deadline is essential to ensure certainty and stability for the Colorado River system beyond 2026. The Department of the Interior is now forcing its own solution. They have given themselves a new deadline. October 1st, 2026, by that date, they will finalize a new operating framework, with or without state approval. This is the federal government preparing to impose drastic water cuts on sovereign states. And the person now in charge of executing this plan is Aubrey Betancourt. In June 2026, she was appointed as the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, a third-generation California farmer, steeped in the brutal realities of Western water, now tasked with telling other farmers and entire cities that the water they have always depended on is no longer there. The federal intervention created yet another set of dominoes. As the Bureau of Reclamation choked the flow from Powell to Mead, they needed a way to keep Powell itself from flatlining. They found a sacrificial lamb. Far upstream, on the Green River tributary in Wyoming and Utah, sits the Flaming Gorge Reservoir. Under an emergency agreement from 2019, the Bureau of Reclamation has the authority to drain Flaming Gorge to prop up Lake Powell. And that is exactly what they are now doing, between April 2026 and April 2027. The government is releasing up to 1 million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge, a massive pulse of water sent downstream to die in the bottom of Lake Powell, just to keep its turbines spinning. The water level at Flaming Gorge is expected to drop by 35 feet. Its own capacity will fall to roughly 59%. The local ecology, the marinas, the recreation economy built around that reservoir are being sacrificed to save Powell, which in turn starves Mead, which threatens the power grid of the entire Southwest. It is a long, cascading line of failure, playing out in real time from the mountains of Wyoming to the border of Mexico. In a frantic, last-ditch effort to keep the lights on, the federal government is throwing money at the problem. On May 21, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced a $52 million grant. The money is to upgrade 3 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines to new wide-head variants. These are remarkable pieces of engineering, designed to operate more efficiently at lower water elevations. But it is not a solution. It is a patch. A $200 million investment would be required for a complete overhaul of all the threatened units. With the current plan, only 5 of the 17 turbines will be capable of operating below the 1,035-foot cliff. 9 of the 12 original turbines threatened by cavitation will still have to be shut down. The $52 million is a response to a crisis that is already here. It does not stop the water level from falling. It only slightly redefines the nature of the power failure when it arrives. This is what collapse looks like on paper. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's own 24-month study, the one released in June 2026, is not a dry government document. It is a script for disaster. It projects Lake Mead to reach 1,040 feet this month, July 2026. That elevation ties the all-time record low set back in July 2022. But then, the forecast continues downward. Through the dry autumn and winter, the line keeps dropping. By July 2027, the model predicts Lake Mead will sit at a catastrophic 1,015.77 feet. That is nearly 20 feet below the turbine cliff. It is just 65 feet above the new, lower operating turbines, and only 120 feet above total dead pool. The term dead pool is often misunderstood. It does not mean the lake is empty. At an elevation of 895 feet, millions of acre-feet of water will remain in Lake Mead. What it means is that the water level has dropped below the lowest intake valves on the dam. The dam can no longer release water downstream by gravity. The river simply stops. No water for the farms of California's Imperial Valley. No water for the cities of Arizona. No water for Mexico. It becomes a stagnant lake, a massive body of trapped, useless water, and the government's own projections show us on a direct path toward that outcome. And then there is the existential question buried inside the politics. The federal government, under Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, is asserting its ultimate authority over the river. They are drawing up the new rules that will be imposed after December 31st, 2026. But what if the states refuse to comply? What happens if Arizona or California files a lawsuit on January 2nd, 2027? Arguing the federal cuts violate a century of water law and compacts? The fight would move from the engineers at the Bureau of Reclamation to the justices of the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, the river would be governed by chaos. The legal uncertainty would paralyze a $1.4 trillion regional economy. The dividing line for this conflict is a small, unassuming spot in the Arizona desert called Lee's Ferry. Just downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, it is the legal partition between the upper and lower basins. For a century, it was an abstract concept on a map. Today, it is the front line in a cold war over the last remaining drops of a dwindling resource. We are watching the slow, deliberate dismemberment of one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. A system of dams and reservoirs that made the modern West possible is now being taken apart, piece by piece, in a desperate attempt to manage its own decline. The decision to drain Flaming Gorge is a perfect microcosm of the entire calamity. To protect the core, the managers are sacrificing the extremities. But the disease is systemic. There is not enough water. There will not be enough water. The 2026 snowpack collapse was not an anomaly. It was a preview. Climate models are clear that the warming and drying of the American West will continue to accelerate, further shrinking the flow of the Colorado. The 16.4 million acre-foot river that the 1922 compact was written for is gone forever. It is a ghost, and we are still trying to write checks against its account. The human element in this story is personified by the people now tasked with the impossible. Look again at Aubrey Betancourt. Her entire life has been defined by California agriculture, an industry that lives or dies based on water allocations from this very river system. Now, she sits in an office in Washington, D.C., as the de facto head of the Bureau of Reclamation, holding the authority to cut water to farms just like the one she grew up on. Or consider Tom Buschatzke in Arizona, the man who has to publicly admit that a power crisis at Hoover Dam is now unavoidable. His job is no longer to prevent the disaster, but merely to manage public perception of its arrival. And then there is Becky Mitchell in Colorado, fighting to protect her state's legal right to water that has not even melted from the mountains yet, knowing that every drop she secures for the upper basin is another drop the lower basin will demand. They are not villains. They are managers of a bankruptcy, negotiating over assets that have already been liquidated by the physics of a hotter, drier world. What we are witnessing is not a natural disaster. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that monumental engineering can permanently overcome natural limits. For 70 years, Hoover Dam stood as a symbol of humanity's power to conquer the desert, to bring light and water to barren lands. Its massive white arc was a monument to progress and control. Today, that same concrete structure is becoming a monument to something else entirely. It is becoming a tombstone for an era of climate stability that we took for granted. The waterline on the edge of Lake Mead, the infamous bathtub ring, is more than just a visual. It is a geological clock, ticking down. And this year, the clock is accelerating. The deliberate holdback of water from Lake Powell is pushing the hands forward at an unnatural speed. Each foot the lake drops is a countdown. From 1,040 in July, down past the turbine cliff at 135, and onward into the uncharted territory below. The system is now eating itself to survive. The logic is brutal. The power generation at Glen Canyon Dam is considered, for now, more critical than the power at Hoover. So water is held in Powell at the direct expense of Mead. To supplement that water, a smaller, less politically powerful reservoir at Flaming Gorge is drained. The entire upper Colorado River basin is being re-engineered, not for growth, but for managed decline. Each decision ripples outward. The loss of 35 feet of water at Flaming Gorge devastates a local economy in Wyoming. The power reduction at Hoover Dam threatens grid stability in Nevada and Arizona. The eventual dead pool at Lake Mead would cripple a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry in California. It is all connected. One contiguous body of water, from the snow-capped Rockies to the Gulf of California. And it is all running out at the same time. The crisis is no longer about drought. It is about arithmetic. There are no easy answers left. The $52 million for new turbines is a gesture, a necessary one, but ultimately a footnote in a much larger story of collapse. It treats a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a promise made in 1922 that the river could not keep. The disease is a climate that has changed faster than our laws and our infrastructure can adapt. The October 1st deadline for a new federal plan is not an endpoint. It is the beginning of a new, more contentious chapter. A chapter where the federal government tries to enforce a reality that many states are not yet willing to accept. The fight for the Colorado River is about to move out of the hands of engineers and into the hands of lawyers and politicians. And water levels will keep dropping while the arguments unfold. The physics of the situation do not care about legal precedent or economic need. The water will continue to evaporate. The ground will continue to absorb it. And less will make it to the dams. The final irony is that Hoover Dam, the very symbol of control over nature, is now completely at the mercy of a decision made about another dam, hundreds of miles upstream. Its fate is being dictated by the needs of Glen Canyon. If you stand on the bypass bridge overlooking Hoover Dam today, you are not just looking at a piece of history. You are looking at the front line of the most significant resource crisis in modern American history. You are looking at a machine that is being systematically, intentionally powered down. The silence of those 12 turbines, when they finally stop spinning, will echo across the entire American West. So 3 questions now hang over the entire Colorado River Basin. With all prior agreements evaporating on December 31st, how will the 7 states and Mexico react when the federal government imposes its will on January 1st? Can technological fixes and frantic investments in efficiency outrun a structural deficit that is growing worse with every heat wave? And what happens when the next sacrificial lamb, Flaming Gorge, has been drained? And there are no more upstream reservoirs left to sacrifice? The water that melted in the Colorado Rockies in the failed spring of 2026 is right now being held behind Glen Canyon Dam. A silent, accumulating debt. 1,048 million acre-feet of it. A phantom supply that should have been in Lake Mead. The turbines at Hoover Dam are still spinning. For now, but they are waiting for water that has already been redirected. Water that will not arrive. And somewhere deep inside the concrete heart of the dam, the machinery is preparing for a silence it was never designed to endure.